Birds were often seen biblically as a symbol of intuition, the birds of the air, as opposed to the fishes in the sea. That the birds of the air referred to divine ideas that are available to human beings, ideas about good, about a greater good that can come into manifestation in our world. So I was happy with these birds, and I began to wonder, well, why had they come to me and what purpose did they serve? We moved up to Michigan, to Frankfurt, about 10 years ago, and I found this beautiful landscape, and at the time I was an outdoor painter, and my heart just opened, and I said, oh, I could paint here for the rest of my life. Had developed a pretty healthy following, had a pretty pleasant life here on the corner of 4th and Forest Avenue here in Frankfurt. I was giving workshops, and in one of my workshops, one of the women said, oh, you would love San Miguel Day and de Mexico. In February of 2015, I went for the first time and was delighted with the colors and the friendliness of the people. It was just such a warm and inviting place that just began to tug at my heartstrings. My husband hadn't come on that trip, and I was sad about that. So in November of 2016, very sick of all the election campaigning and all of that rhetoric, we decided to go to Mexico and be in San Miguel during the election. When the election turned out as it did, we were surprised because the election had been predicted to go one way and it went in the complete opposite direction. It was hard to be in San Miguel at that time because so much of the campaign rhetoric from the Republican candidate had been about building a wall and keeping people from Mexico from entering the United States. We came home, and I was terrified. I didn't know what would happen, with our country. And like so many people, I began having a lot of inability to sleep. My painting style went from one of looking out at the world and painting what I would see, the lake or a barn, a pretty scene. As an outdoor painter, landscape painter, I had learned that not to use black paint. And so for most of my painting life, I had never opened a tube of black paint. But in this situation, I felt like the only thing that really could reflect my mood of this period was black paint. And so I began just flinging paint at the canvas. And a lot of times it was the black paint that was flying. I just kept intuiting and just discovering as I put paint on what the painting wanted to become. I saw these birds and I felt comforted by them. And the more I worked with them and allowed them, to have a place on the canvas, I began to sleep better. And I began to feel less afraid. In February of 2018, I went on a trip to Atlanta. I grew up in the Atlanta area, and Atlanta is where we'd moved from when we moved to Michigan. And one morning I was just stuck in traffic. We were just stuck, sitting still. It was gridlock. Just feeling the pain of our country. And wondering, isn't there some way of understanding what's going on that isn't about right and wrong? We're just stuck in these cages of belief. I believe I'm right, you believe you're right, my side, your side, and it's like it's an invisible cage. It's as much of a confinement, as much of a border as the wall that this president wanted to build at the southern border. And I had this strong sense, if only we could just all just take a time out and we could go sit still and open up to what this higher truth, this higher understanding might be, and let it be revealed to us. So here's where I get this big idea, that what if these birds that have been coming and reassuring me and bringing me comfort and helping me sleep better at night, helping me realize that there's sort of a bigger picture, what if they've come not just to help me, but to help humanity? What if there really is something that I am supposed to do with these paintings, or with the birds that are coming through the paintings, that's for the world? Now, I had a background, of church, of having tried in my own way to create sanctuary for people. And I know how religion can also become a cage. I'd written about church as a box, where people go to find security and safety. And what would it be like to create a sanctuary, kind of like a bird sanctuary, only for humans? And I thought, yeah, maybe this is what my birds are all about. It's reminding us that survival for birds often depends on having a refuge, a designated spot, where they can go, where they can rest, where they can feed. So I guess that's what was the first notion of the art installation that became Birds Fly In, a human refuge. Well, that was a very big idea. Sometimes you can dismiss these things and say, well, who am I to think that, something like this, some, powerful idea like this would come to me, to little me. But I've also had the experience of having very good ideas come that have resulted in very creative manifestations. So I didn't dismiss it out of hand. In fact, that evening in Atlanta, there was a little dinner party. So I shared my idea with some friends. My first way of conceiving of it was sweet urban sit spots. And I thought of, well, if you could have a telephone booth, for those who remember what telephone booths are all about, on a street corner in a city where you could go in and there would be the art, some art with the birds in them, and maybe you just sit quietly for a few minutes and that would give you the time out from the craziness of the world. Well, I was describing this and my friend Sherry said, well, you should have a soundtrack. You could have bird song in this. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting idea. A couple of months after I came back from Atlanta with this idea, still kind of entertaining the idea, I went back to Mexico, went back to San Miguel to do my art retreat for women. And on one of our breaks, I was walking through the Central Plaza and I heard this violin music. And it was just the sweetest, most soulful sound I think I'd ever heard. And it was like coming from an area, I couldn't quite tell where it was from, so I felt it was like the Pied Piper was leading me to this restaurant, which is called Los Milagros, the Miracles. And inside the restaurant, in the kind of dark, there was this man playing violin, and he had his hair up on his head, and he looked like a bird. He had dreadlocks, and he'd stuck them up on top of his head, and they were sticking out like feathers. I said, I've got to paint to this man's music. And I went to the Central Plaza. I set up my outdoor painting easel. And while he performed at Milagros, I made a painting. And it was wonderful because a bunch of school children came up all around me, and they loved seeing the birds as they were emerging on the canvas. And I could see I'd caught David's eye. So afterwards, I went over and showed him what I'd been painting and introduced myself and learned from him that it was his dream to come to America. And so he became kind of emblematic as I, both resisted and entertained the idea of Birds Fly In. It became more real when I met an actual person who wanted to come to America, but who couldn't, would not be allowed. When I came back to Michigan, I investigated a few ways that maybe he could come this way. He could come to Interlaken. And I communicated with him back and forth. I could tell he wasn't really believing that I could be helpful. And I learned later that many people had a similar impulse, like, oh, I want you to help you bring your music to the world. And nothing had ever panned out. We kind of ended our email conversation fairly soon. In October of 2018, I realized that it was important that I follow through on this idea. Things had been happening at the southern border. Images had been shown on the news of children in cages. And this visual display was so painful to me. But it also inspired, this idea of like, what would a refuge look like? What would mean something to people in the United States if they were asked to find sanctuary in the place that these children had been taken? So the notion of a structure that would somehow echo what was happening at the southern border began to resonate with me. Back to San Miguel in October now of 2018, I actively sought out David Mendoza. I go to a club where he's playing on Friday evenings, and he says, and this is my song that's called Maxul. In Mayan, it means without borders. And I, as I do now, got goosebumps and said, wow, this guy is tuned into this project without even knowing that there is a project. I reintroduced myself and I said, I'm working on an art installation that will be a multimedia and will include music. And I need music that's attuned to birds. And I showed him some of the bird paintings I'd been making, and he looked and he said, oh my, he says, that's what I see when I close my eyes and play violin. I see those birds. That's what they look like. I felt that I had been guided intuitively to find him. His music came and found me, and I followed it. I went on to commission him to create an hour's worth of music that would serve as the soundtrack, so that when people were invited to come into the refuge structure, they would see these large paintings of birds and they would hear this beautiful music. And from then on, we became collaborators. He's the primary collaborator in Birds Fly In. Once I started receiving the sketches that he was creating, I began painting exclusively to this music. I'd get up in the morning, large canvas, and begin to make the marks that I had come to realize were deeply significant to me. These calligraphic black marks that seemed to me like a language that contained birds. And I began to feel like there's something that wants to be communicated in these paintings. Someone told me about a book called When Women Were Birds by a woman named Terry Tempest Williams. It's about these illiterate Chinese women who developed their own written language to communicate women's wisdom. And the language is called Nushu, but these ideograms were based on bird tracks. And sure enough, what Nushu looks like, it's like bird tracks. It's a language inspired by birds. And so I felt like I was, in some unconscious way, hooking into this wisdom, this women's wisdom that had to do with birds. And my bird tracks were these black marks. And then on top of the black marks were, just intuitively placed, I would just have paint tubes just randomly pick up just based on my hearing of the music. There'd be a swoop because the violin went someplace, or there would be rhythm because I was hearing drums. So the paintings became very lyrical in my view. They had lots of color, but they weren't all about color. There was a lot of space. It became very characteristic that there would be this sort of warm white space that would be applied kind of at the end of the painting. So I developed a method, and underneath it all, intuition. How is it we're being guided towards some resolution of these questions? One of the things about my personality that I've come to learn about over the years is that I hate asking for help. I have, coming out of my family or whatever, developed, an incredible ability to be self-sufficient. And it has always seemed like a weakness to not be able to do everything myself. And that belief, that's one of those cages that I've allowed myself to be imprisoned by, this belief that I must do it alone. And somewhere along the way I heard, you alone can do it, but you can't do it alone. There's a piece of Birds Fly In that I own. I own this project. I own that this idea came to me. I own that I'm responsible for keeping it true to the original idea. But I can't do this by myself. The music was one thing. It was beautiful, to intuitively, meet this young man, to have the music just come together like magic. The other stuff, the physical manifestation, was harder. All I knew is that I thought it would be interesting to have chain link fence somehow involved, but I didn't know how to even think about a building or what the thing would look like.
But there could be a bar across the top of that, and that would then make it a complete circle.
My name is Rue Davison. I am married to the artist Ellie. Well, I was there when the birds first started emerging.
We had some new neighbors that we wanted to meet, get to know a little bit better, so I invited Will Schley and his wife Beth to come for dinner. When they came over after dinner, I said, well, I've got this music project going on, and would you like to listen to this music? And so I played the sketches that David had been sending me, and Will was interested. I said, this project is inspired by the migration issues that are so challenging right now. And Will, being from Germany, he says, I grew up 60 miles from the East German border.
As a young person, I visited family or relatives in eastern part of Germany, or East Germany at the time, and they were people just like West German people, but they didn't have all the things, and they were pretty desperate. So, yes, I'm familiar with fencing and the background of what it tried to do and not successfully.
It kind of took my breath away that now another person who is from another country seems to be resonating with this project. You know, another person who is not a US citizen, but who has migrated to the United States. I mean, I'm married to one of those people. Rue is English, and Rue came over to marry me, and we had to go through all that visas and applications and pay money and all of that in order to have him come and be able to marry me. Suddenly, I realized it's like, wow, this is really big. And as I described the project to Will, he said, well, you know, I'm an architect. I said, you are? Because I didn't know that at all.
My specialty is, you know, designing something on the computer in 3D, so it helps people visualize what they have in their minds.
I was like, well, I really need some help. You know, and I found that I was able in that context to just, because the idea was bigger than me, it wasn't about me asking for help, it was the project needing help. And his strong feelings about what was going on at the southern border allowed him just to say, I want to help. I want to be part of this. And so he became a very important collaborator in terms of helping me visualize and then Rue to construct the refuge structure using the materials that I had envisioned, the chain link fencing material.
Many years ago, Ellie and I went to the Marmottan Museum in Paris, which has a very large Monet collection. And in the Monet room, there's this very large, curved, circular bench. So you can sort of sit in front of a Monet, look at it for a while, and then shuffle along and look at the next one. You can sort of basically go all the way around this. Ellie had been inspired by this slow art movement, where apparently statistics are if you go to a major museum and look at a grand master painting, the average person spends 17 seconds in front of it looking at it.
This is a statistic that was very interesting to me because as an artist, I spend, you know, hours with a painting. You know, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. There are painters who are working on, you know, a single painting for 5 years.
So we'd had this idea of a central bench or seating area and the music and encouraging people basically to sit and listen.
I started listening to the news, as painful as it was to listen to, and I took large sheets of loose canvas, just tacked it up on the wall, stapled it to the wall of my garage, and just grabbed these very strong colors, you know, a lot of red, and found myself just making these marks that were reflected, you know, expressing my anger and my frustration. You know, just take a tube of red paint and, you know, squirt it in black and dark blue, and some of them look like, you know, blood, but there were birds, you know, like birds sitting on a wire, this sense of horizons, people behind barbed wire. The paintings that I had been making were beautiful and lyrical and spoke of intuition and hope and healing, and these were much more forceful and edgy and all about the problem. As I developed this series, I realized that these would be the backstory paintings, and they would go on the outside of the structure. Because I kept just playing with this inside, outside. The outer world is filled with human problems, like migration, like disease, like war. And then the inside is all filled with resolution, with hope, with with the resources to meet these problems. Around the same time, I'd been in San Miguel a couple more times, and I learned about these shoes that were used by asylum seekers as they traveled from oftentimes Nicaragua, Guatemala, as they came north to the U.S. border, to the northern Mexican border. Abba House is a halfway shelter that is a real refuge that allows people to stay for three days typically. Just imagine leaving your home, probably under duress. Some of them are fleeing, imminent violence, and to basically take what you can put in a small backpack. And they give everyone who travels on a new pair of shoes. So they had collected thousands of pairs of used shoes. And I was offered the possibility of bringing some of those shoes to be part of the Birds Flying In installation. We settled on a date to install the exhibit, and that date was August of 2020. As we all know, everything shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020. So all of the work that had gone into Birds Fly In was now totally put on hold. We had met with the chain link fence company that was going to make the panels that we would put together to form the structure the September before. But when we went to it's time to move forward, they couldn't get materials. They literally said, we don't have the chain link. My anxiety was not so much about COVID, but about would Birds Fly In fly? It was less than 2 weeks before the exhibit opened that we were able to finally know that we would have the chain link fence material. By August, there had been a subsidence of the virus, and with distancing and the masking, we were given permission to go ahead and install the exhibit. So what we want people to do is really have an experience, of seeing what's there and seeing how, not whether I like it or not, but just what does the painting, what's it communicating? And what's this music about? And what's this cage about? And then, because everyone's going to have a pencil given to them, then here's a blank page to record their response if they want to, write a few words, get some ideas.
I thought it was really inspiring, and I felt like I needed it today, like I was released. And so I wrote a bunch of poems. I think they're quite good.
Always looking for, how Birds Fly In can grow and become more accessible to people. I got the idea, let's just translate the whole thing into Spanish. And so, again, in one of those intuitive, magical meetings, I was introduced to Marguerite Cotto, who is a native Spanish speaker who was born in Puerto Rico, but who has her own kind of migration story. And she has taken all the text from the exhibit, the things that are posted on the wall, the placards on the wall, all of the poetry, all of the essays that form the text of the catalog, and translated it with her just magnificent feel for language into Spanish.
I would like to see this move to communities that have a wealth of smaller communities within them that don't often get the opportunity to see themselves expressed in art, in music, and in the written word all together. I think this program would be extraordinarily valuable, not only at other educational museums, such as the Denos Museum Center, but in community museum settings that can have that place for people to mingle that may not know how to say hello to each other or ¿qué tal? Saludos when they're out in the street.
One part of Birds Fly In that I had really been hopeful for, but that ultimately didn't work out, had to do with bringing David Mendoza to perform his music live with the installation of Birds Fly In. To that end, I went through a very long and complicated and expensive visa application process to obtain a visa that would allow him to come in for that performance. U.S. immigration denied the application on every count on the basis that it would not be a unique cultural experience. 18 pages worth. David was not given permission to enter the country. David often says about his music, he says it's for humanity. And that's my feeling about Birds Fly In, is that it's a gift to humanity, and humanity will do with it what it will.